Anger and outrage mount across the United States. People of color frustrated over racism and police brutality, inspiring massive worldwide protests in Europe, Africa, Latin America, and Australia. As US President Donald Trump and Congress address police reform, as history unfolds before our eyes, we ask, how did we get here? And where will this moment take us? In the next half hour, we'll hear from a Guinean mother whose son died in a hail of police bullets, as well as those leading the calls for change in America and in their own countries. Hello and welcome to Our Voices. I'm Heidi Fitzpatrick. We begin here in the US, where it's been a tumultuous few weeks of nationwide protests. Ayen Biyor and Medina Maishanu have been covering the George Floyd demonstrations here in Washington. They take us back now to the most significant moments.
Now, I've walked up and down this street for years. It's a famous street. It leads directly to the White House. But on the two most violent nights of protest here in Washington, D.C., this street, now renamed Black Lives Matter Plaza, was unrecognizable. Police and protesters faced off right here on this street. Protesters were throwing anything they could pick up at police, including fireworks that made huge, loud noises. Police, on the other hand, responded with force. They threw tear gas, pepper spray, and flashbangs that made huge explosive noise.
I believe they're trying to extinguish this fire, but for now, we're going to get away from this and get to safety.
Now, if you look to either side of me, you'll see that the windows on these buildings are boarded up, and that's because there's a lot of destruction and a lot of businesses had their windows smashed in. Now, there's been a shift in the last week or so. Protests have been very calm, largely peaceful even. So what's next is the big question. Now, if you look on the ground, you'll see Black Lives Matter written in big yellow letters. The mayor of DC had this painted on the ground as a show of solidarity for the protesters. Now, protesters say that's not enough. They want actual policy changes. Further down the street, you'll see something else written in big yellow letters: defund the police. Now, what does defund the police mean? Well, I spoke to a ton of protesters who told me that it doesn't necessarily mean abolishing the police system, but it does mean to them redirecting funds that are given to police and putting them instead in communities, so in schools or in hospitals. And to them, it also means changing the way policing is done. Now, opponents say these ideas are radical and they will take years, if not decades, to see them happen.
So Heidi, I'm standing at the exact same point I stood a couple of weeks ago when I was reporting the George Floyd protest. The first thing I can remember after I arrived at the protest ground was the high sentiment, the anger, the rage of the thousands of protesters that were chanting and shouting right there.
Hands up! Don't shoot! Hands up! Don't shoot!
The first thing I tried to do was go to the front line to get some footage of the police and the protesters. The protesters and the police started pushing back, and I found myself right on the floor. And in that moment, I realized I had to change my mindset just to get the assignment done. So the people were so angry and agitated that most of them couldn't even find a way to construct their thoughts. It was hard for me to get interviews and videos from people that were standing there. So what struck me the most was the diversity of the crowd. There were people of different races, people of different colors, people of different backgrounds, just coming out together to fight for one cause. The high scale of protest, even though a lot of people were wearing their masks, but the way people were standing close to each other and the proximity between them kept bringing up one question: what about COVID-19? So the few people I spoke to, they told me that being out there fighting for one cause surpasses their fear for COVID-19. So Heidi, even though these protests have died down in a lot of cities here in the US, the unity and dedication I saw out there showed me that this is not yet over.
Medina and Ayen, thank you very much. Now, the protests have also revived debate about slavery, colonial history, and heritage. Statues of controversial historical figures in the United States and Europe were toppled, defaced and beheaded. In scenes resembling South Africa in 2015, when student protests brought down this statue of British colonist Cecil John Rhodes. And as Henry Ridgwell reports, the George Floyd demonstrations brought a dramatic moment of reckoning in Britain itself.
In Bristol, a city that once boomed on the profits of slavery, a statue of Edward Colston, a 17th century slave trader, was torn down. It was long a divisive symbol, a tribute to a man who built schools and hospitals, but who enslaved tens of thousands of black Africans, shipping them across the Atlantic, a journey that killed many men, women and children.
We have to walk these streets and see that statue of Colston's every day. That's what it means. That statue is a kick in the face to all black people. It's a disgrace. And now look at it. Now look at it. Gone. You're gone. I'm gone.
Bristol's mayor sympathises with the protesters in his city.
We have a city to run. We need to have order. But if you fail to understand these kind of events, then you create the conditions for more and bigger types of events like these, in the future. It's a very significant symbolic act, but it doesn't deliver the affordable homes, the job opportunities, the educational opportunities, the access to the professions, political power, economic power that actually underpins race inequality.
The British government takes a different view.
Sheer vandalism and disorder completely is unacceptable, and it's right actually the police follow up on that and make sure that justice is undertaken.
Protests erupted in several cities across Britain. Tens of thousands of people marched on the US Embassy in London.
I've just had enough of it. I'm sick of having to explain to my children that because they're black, they have to act a certain way, they have to behave a certain way, they have to work 10 times harder to get anywhere in life.
There were violent clashes between some demonstrators and police in London. 22 officers were injured, including a policewoman who fell from her horse after it bolted. The riderless horse trampled the protester. Prime Minister Boris Johnson said the demonstrations had been subverted by thuggery. In Glasgow, Scotland, activists changed the names of streets linked to slave traders. In Belgium, protesters defaced a statue of King Leopold II, who oversaw the killing of millions of Congolese during colonial rule. Back in Bristol, the fallen statue of Edward Colston was dumped into the harbour, where his slave ships used to dock 350 years ago. Critics of its destruction say the statue was an important reminder of a dark and complicated history. Others say its raising has done far more to educate Britons about black oppression, a history that for many resonates deeply today. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, the world witnessed the final moments of George Floyd's life because of a video of his death shared on social media. Well, the activism that video sparked on the streets is carrying back onto social media. Tatenda Gumbo has been following the conversations online.
I think there's been a very robust conversation happening on social media. What are the experiences that people are having within the context of the United States, wherever they live, that lead them to say, hey, Black Lives Matter? People started exchanging resources. You had people who were protesting, but you had some who were like, hey, I'm at home. How do I still get involved? How am I able to donate money? How am I able to help initiatives that are focusing on this issue? And so you saw, exchanges where you had people talking about financial resources, be that here you can donate to these memorial funds, you can donate to initiatives in your particular communities, you can donate to the larger Black Lives Matter initiatives. And I started to see that, these conversations kind of led to people kind of sharing, if you are a non-Black person of color, if you are a white person in America, what do you say? How do you start off conversations? How do you approach your friends or approach your colleagues about their experiences? And given this time that we are in, this COVID-19 era, I think we have had a lot of time to ourselves. We had a lot of time to kind of sit down and reflect. And I think that might be kind of also helping to kind of push the needle. You've also seen this exchange of just like experiences internationally. You've seen where people talk about their experiences when it comes to protesting. Because of the way that the police have responded at some of these protests, opened up that need for people to better understand what might happen if you get out there. What do you do if there's tear gas that's thrown your direction? How do you handle that? I don't remember just seeing this at this level the last time we saw some protests happening.
Tatienda Gumbo there, tracking the conversation online. And that is where we would like you to connect with us. Tell us, what do you think about the impact of the George Floyd demonstrations? Do you think they will bring about the change that people are expecting? Our handle is at VOA Our Voices. You can also catch us on WhatsApp. That number is right there on your screen. Still to come here on Our Voices, what is at stake for African immigrants coming to America and having to navigate this country's racial divides? Also, more than 20 years after police shot at her son 41 times, a Guinean mother talks to me about justice, change, and restoring her son's dignity. Those stories next. Is about more than just sitting here and talking about women's issues. It's about listening to them
and bringing their opinions to the table and making sure their voices are heard.
Because our lived experiences, our stories, and our voices will help shape the next generation.
You're with Our Voices. Welcome back. The police shooting of a Guinean immigrant triggered outrage in the United States more than 20 years ago. 4 police officers fired at Amadou Diallo dozens of times as he stood in front of his home in New York. Diallo was unarmed. The police officers involved were acquitted at trial. I recently spoke to Diallo's mother, who believes the protests today could actually lead to change when the protests over her son's death did not.
21 years ago, February 4th, 1999, my life changed. My son, my firstborn, Amadou Diallo, was gunned down for no reason at night in his own vestibule. That moment, it was a shock. The 41 shots echoed around the world. It was a defining moment in history where all creed, all race, everyone came together, marching and demanding how come a human being be shot at 41 times. 41. It was a very, very high-profile case.
Diallo says in New York, Amadou worked hard to save for college. She says it was painful to hear her son, who was educated, multilingual, and well-traveled, described in the media as just an immigrant street vendor.
Sitting in the courtroom, going through the process without giving the chance to even tell the jury who Amadou was as the mother was the most difficult and painful experience ever.
The police officers said they shot Amadou because he appeared to reach for a gun. Amadou had only a wallet in his pocket.
I will never forget sitting down and hearing that not guilty verdict. It was indescribable for me. It was difficult. But I remember just not looking at them. I couldn't do it. When I addressed the media, I asked for calm and prayers because there was overnight uproar. I just kept my head high and I told people that I would be fighting for equality, for justice, for life. I believe my son opened the door then, 21 years ago, because that was a conversation without any social media. But the media was really telling about this incident around the world. People were watching, protesting, reading about it. The difference today is because we have social media. This video that this young girl was able to record and offer to the world so that the world can see the way George Floyd was killed. Can you believe if we don't have that tape, we don't see that video, what would have been the story? This time, these young people who are locking hands and marching, protesting, and demanding, saying that Black Lives Matter. Even big corporations are not ignoring that today. They understand that we have to listen to the youth. We have to address this issue. We must find solutions, long-lasting solutions to solve this problem. Otherwise, I don't know where we go from here.
And you can find out more about the Amadou Diallo Foundation's work on the organization's website. Now, many immigrants continue to come to America in search of independence and success, but for some, that is not always what they find. Ayen Biyor spoke to young Africans who joined the protests here in Washington.
All Africans should want to fight because we all resonate from the same place. You know, we all come from the same place. We all originate from the same place, and this is all our fight. It's not just African-American fight, it's our fight as well.
This is a turning point. It's something that I was meant to do. I'm very pro-Black. I have Black brothers, I have Black sisters, I have a Black nephew. I have to worry about when his innocence will start going away, when the police begin to see him as a threat. I have to come out here and fight for my family, my future kids. That's what I'm all about.
The American dream is not dead. Everybody can come and can enjoy. I moved here when I was 16 years old. I enjoyed living in the United States. I got my education in the United States. To see the struggle that African Americans have to go through every day is sometimes mind-boggling. I have kids. I was first-class citizen in my country. I don't feel like raising my kids to be second-class citizen in anywhere in the world. So I'm here to show the African American community or anyone in the world they're feeling being oppressed because of their race or their color. You're not alone in this fight.
I'm out here not because I'm African, I'm out here not because I'm Black, I'm out here because guess what? Someone was murdered. People get murdered every single day. I mean, this doesn't end just in the European countries. It happened in Africa. It happened in Gaza. It happens with the Palestinian people. It happens in El Salvador. It happens so many places. If you cannot identify yourself as a human being, I don't know what else you live for.
As immigrants, we often come here and we're looked down upon. So if the system doesn't change, that is obviously going to make us second-class citizens in this country, and it's going to make our lives less valuable. So we're in this fight. This fight, it means a lot to us.
So how do you navigate America's racial divides at work or at school? Oriani Tangishaka spoke to someone who's had personal experience and offers some practical professional advice.
I am an immigrant from the Republic of Haiti, and I can tell you that I've had enormous successes here in America, you know, through education. It is critical for immigrants when you come to the United States for you to understand the history of where you are. One of the quickest ways to gain wealth in America is through the purchase of a home, right? A Senate report came out this year, the States of Black America, and it shows that roughly 48% of Black people in this country own their homes in comparison to 72% of white Americans. The median wealth for Black families in America is $17,000, and the median wealth for white Americans is $171,000 US. So these are the kinds of disparities that you have to understand coming in. You need to understand that you may be bright, you may have the capacity, but because of the lack of network that has been created because of racism in this country and Jim Crow laws and so on, you may not necessarily get to fulfill the true American dream that you can achieve if the system was even all across the board.
What advice specifically do you have for women to be able to navigate in those systems and to be able to succeed?
You know, your network is your net worth. It can be very complicated navigating this system as an immigrant. But if you have the right network, if you have a mentor that will say, hey, take this route, versus that route. Or another point that I think is important is a sponsor. A mentor just kind of tells you, apply for this role, take this course, pursue an education in this field. Whereas a sponsor is that person who has the economic power and also sometimes have the political power to where they can make a phone call on your behalf and you get a job, right? These are people that may not necessarily have the time to hang out with you, may not have the time to edit your resume.
That's right.
But they have the power, they have the influence. You have to meet people, you have to build a network, and you have to have people who are going to advocate for you.
Joanne LeBlanc, thank you so much for your contribution once again. We appreciate it.
Well, that is some good advice. After the break, we widen our focus and we go to Kenya to see how activists there are demonstrating against police brutality. We'll also speak to a retired police chief to find out what officers can do to build community trust and respect. Back in a moment. You're with Our Voices, welcome back. From Senegal to South Africa to Kenya, there are shows of solidarity with protesters in the United States.
No justice!
But across Africa, there is now a growing call to improve policing at home. We spoke to one of the activists behind some of the demonstrations in Nairobi. Nafula Wafula says it is time to address police reform everywhere.
Every single time there's been cases of police brutality in the US or black people killed by the police, all these conversations have been happening. This, I feel, is the first time it has blown up the way it has in terms of sparking protests worldwide. But I think the message we're trying to spread is that what happened with George Floyd is a reminder to the rest of the world of the inequalities that we have in our different countries. And that as Brazil, for example, protest about what's happening in Brazil in the favelas, and persons in the UK protest about inequalities or racial inequalities in the US and in Australia, as it pertains to indigenous people. In Africa, we will also talk about police brutality and inequalities that affect persons living in informal urban settlements or that are structured that inform the poverty and the oppression that ordinary citizens face. Our inequalities, honestly, are structured in colonial systems because our police service is in Kenya and also in other countries that were previously colonized are built on colonial systems. What is racism in the US, it might be ethnicity here, right? And that ethnicity and inequality on the basis of ethnicity also stems from colonial structures. The policing structures need to be responsive to our needs and our realities as Africans. And reforms need to consider, for example, the pay of police officers. How much do they earn? What is their housing like? How do we recruit? What does the curricula for training the police service, what does it look like? What is their relationship with communities? How do we get rid of the God mentality that would look at an ordinary citizen as being less? And reforms need to be holistic, that look at both the police service, look at the oversight authorities, and look at the community and how all these different bodies engage.
Nafula Wafula there speaking to us from Nairobi, Kenya. We turn now to someone who has worn the police uniform and run entire police departments here in the US. Cedric Alexander is a public safety expert and a former police chief in DeKalb County, Georgia and Rochester, New York. He says effective policing is about relationships and respect.
There has been a constant over time separation between police and communities of color. And there has been a lot of racism in American policing, a lot. But that's not to say that there are not a lot of good police officers out there, because there is. Social unrest that we're all living in right now, along with COVID, are people who are saying enough is enough. And a lot of local police departments and jurisdictions are also making efforts to reform their departments, and because we got to do something clearly very different here because of the American people will no longer accept what we have been doing, and rightly so. But people have trust in their police department means they have to have a relationship with you. If you treat them fairly, if you listen to what they have to say, if you allow them to have input as to what's going on, that builds trust. Building trust is not that hard to do. It's about building relationships. And there's a certain amount of legitimacy that goes with that.
Well, I asked Alexander what the best strategies are for policing protests.
Well, when people are peacefully protesting, the police job is to make sure they have the opportunity to exercise their First Amendment right in this country, and that's to peacefully protest. You don't get in the way of that. You don't have an opinion about it. But when those become violent, and the burning and the bricks and the bottles being thrown, that's not acceptable. And of course, then police have to take assertive action to remove those people from the crowd because it is no longer safe for anybody that's out there. So they have that responsibility. So when I see police officers and chiefs of police joining arms with the crowd, it's got to be genuine. Because why would you not? You are part of that community. And chiefs and police officers should march and walk with them and embrace, because that's how you build relationships. And you're building relationships built on goodness and kindness.
Cedric Alexander is the author of The New Guardians, Policing American Communities for the 21st Century. US President Donald Trump recently signed an executive order on some police reforms. Among others, the measure calls for certification bodies to train officers on de-escalation techniques and use of force standards. More sweeping overhauls to the nation's policing are under consideration in the US Congress. You can read more about these measures on voanews.com. Now, before we go, we leave you with some beautiful images of a couple taking their wedding vows at a demonstration here in America. Do stay safe. We'll see you next time. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.